head downstairs. The rest of you can have a seat. As you do, if you would take a moment and find your prayer sheet, and we'll go ahead and take a look at that. Pastor, any updates you care to share about the prayer?
I do. I'm on green there. I do have two actually. Tammy Lovell, who's not with us today, recovering from surgery here in the upper back. They go through the front of the throat. Many of you understand how that's done. But she's healing and doing well overall, and wanted to say thank you for all the cards and everything. We're very, very grateful. The second one is, I shared with you a number of months ago about I used to go to Beaver Dam and get a nice coffee probably 4 days a week. And about every morning I had a lovely older lady named Dolly Beach who would fix that for me. One day she took my hand and said, my husband has cancer. And I said, I'll be happy to walk this journey with you. She had planned for me to get to her house, but I got a call Friday. He was in ICU with kidney failure and congestion and all kinds of problems. But when I got to ICU, he was surrounded with heart doctors, and after almost 38 years of ministry, I thought I'd experienced everything you can experience. But he was having a heart attack at that moment. They're doing everything they could, and the helplessness I felt, no doubt the family did, to just watch a man have a heart attack and not be able to do anything. And I was able to slip in and pray with him, but he was in so much pain. They life-flighted him to Columbus, and he passed away at 3:30 then on Saturday morning. So I'll have his funeral. He was not a believer, and just to sit there and know what the need is, but not be able to get there, he couldn't have received it anyways. It's so much pain in and out. But his name is Ron, so if you pray for Ron and Dolly Beach, I'd appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Let's take just a few moments of quiet prayer here, and then Pastor, I'd ask you when you feel appropriate if you would lead us in prayer.
Holy Father, there are many needs on our prayer sheet today. There are unspoken needs that are not there. There are private things, and you know that I've been involved in 2 or 3 very confidential, heavy-duty type things this week. Not problems I made, but just very hard things. And Lord, it's not about me, but it's about the people that I know about and their situations I pray today. And I pray for Dolly Beach and her daughter Christina and his sisters. I pray, Lord, that as we organize the funeral and I share the gospel, that some good will come out of this beyond what's happened thus far. And I pray especially for Dolly that you would wrap your arms around her and love her and minister comfort to her heart. Lord, I thank you for those that have come through surgeries and they're doing well and healing. Those like Mark Hirschberger and others that are in chemotherapy, and pray that this cancer will be driven from his body. He'll live a long, healthy life. And Lord, for the other needs that are there, and they're all important, Lord. Lord, some have issues that, are beyond our ability to fix. That's why we pray. blessing upon our brother Matt as he brings the word today. What a blessing it was in the early service. I know it will be here as well. So we thank you for that in Jesus' name. Amen.
The world is looking for a redeemer, aren't they? A lot of people don't even know it, but that's really what they're searching for, is the redeemer of their souls. And they do it in a lot of different ways. I've told you about Patrick in my class, and I've had a chance to interact with him a lot. The other day we were talking in class, and I'm not even sure how it came out, but we started talking about marriage. It's kind of weird to talk with freshmen and sophomores about marriage. But he said, you know, Mr. Horn, he's like, I don't even think I want to get married. I know what it was. Somebody had broken up with their girlfriend. Big drama in high school. But he said, you know, Mr. Horn, I don't really think I want to get married. And I was like, okay. I was like, why? And he's like, the only thing I've ever seen is yelling and fighting. And I said, you know, I just want you to know that there's more than that. And they said, Mr. Horn, do you fight with your wife? I said, well, you know, we get upset sometimes, but just in that moment, without sharing Jesus in the middle of my class, I just said, I want you to know that it doesn't have to be that way. And there's more to life than fighting and yelling. And I was just struck at this young man. He's searching. He wants somebody in his life that loves him for who he is. And our Savior is the one that offers that. He offers to be that Redeemer that we're going to sing about. He offers to take the broken things and make them beautiful because of who he is. I just felt the need to share that with you this morning. We are standing in the presence this morning of our Redeemer. Regardless of where we are at in our lives, he wants to be that for us. There is a Redeemer, Jesus, God's own Son, precious Lamb of
finishing up the series of Together, and our message today is Together in Faith, and it's in Hebrews 12:1, and if you can find that and stand with me, we'll read it real quick. I've got it here on the screen. We read, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out before us." Now, if you pray with me. Father, I thank you for this morning, and I invite you to come in and take over. I pray that I am just your vessel. I thank you for the message you've given me, but if you need to change it, if you need to rearrange things, I give you permission. And in fact, I ask that you would do that I would decrease and you would increase. We thank you for all you do for us in Jesus' name. Amen. You can be seated. So, we're going to talk about faith. And this verse right off the bat, I'm not going to take you a long time to get there, tells us that we are not alone in our faith. We are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. We are together with each other. We are to encourage one another in faith. Our faith journey is not something we do solo. So we are together in faith. I'm done. End of sermon, right? No, we're gonna go a little bit deeper, because to first really appreciate that faith that we're sharing together, we must understand it. What is that faith? What's it look like? What's it look like lived out? Can we see that? So the original title when I preached this over at Ada was Unreasonable Faith. And I put that in quotation marks on purpose, and you'll see that in a little bit, why I did that. So if we're talking about faith, we first need to define this faith. And Webster's dictionary says that it's complete trust or confidence in someone or something like loyalty. If we look to the scriptures to find our definition, Hebrews 11:1 says, "Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen." Now, I don't see anything in there that points to reason. In fact, we can trust without reason. We can have confidence without reason. We can be assured of things without reason, and we can be convicted of things without reason. So in the technical sense of this definition, faith is void of reason. Therefore, it is unreasonable, by definition. Now, we don't have to say unreasonable faith the whole time, because it's by definition unreasonable. But I'm probably going to say it a whole bunch today. And I'm playing with this a little bit, having a little more fun, because I actually believe that faith is the most reasonable response we can have to Christ.
That's good.
It is an unreasonable thing when the world views it from the outside. When you enter Christ into that situation, unreasonableness becomes reasonableness. So, to really get a good look at what faith is and experience it some through the lives of other people, we're going to take a look first in the scriptures and then elsewhere at people who exemplify faith, who live lives that show us what faith really is about. The first guy we're going to talk about is Abraham. And I'm assuming that most of you know the story of Abraham, and we're not picking up right at the beginning. He was called away from his homeland. God said, "I'm going to take you over here and I'm going to make a great nation out of you." And he said, "I'm going to give you a son in your old age." So these are all steps of faith, and we can talk about them all day. Well, we're going to pick it up here where he's testing Abraham. He says in Genesis 22:1 and 2, "Sometime later God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. Then God said, 'Take your son, your only son whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you.' So he says, 'I gave you a promise. You believed me unreasonably. You're old. You didn't have to have a baby. I gave that to you, and now I'm saying go sacrifice it.' We have another unreasonable request. So how does Abraham respond to this? We read in 22:9-11, "When they reached the place God told him about, Abraham went." It doesn't say he wrestled with this decision. It says he went. He had faith. He says, "Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, 'Abraham, Abraham.' 'Here I am,' he replied. So God spared his son. And in this story, we see a lot of the what, but we really don't get a picture inside Abraham's head. What's going on inside his head that makes him believe that God's going to do something? If we go to Hebrews 11:17-19, it says, By faith, when God tested him, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, 'It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned.' Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. So here we see God makes an unreasonable request. Abraham follows him in what we would determine an unreasonable fashion. But inside his head, he's using reason. He's saying, well, if God's called me to this, he must be able to raise the dead. Now, if I were to tell you somebody raised from the dead, you might say, yeah, Jesus raised from the dead, Lazarus raised from the dead. We've heard this. Abraham has never heard of such a thing in his life. To date in the history of the world, nobody's been raised from the dead. This is an unreasonable expectation that he has of his God and what his God is capable of. So he's really kind of acting out of lunacy here. He's kind of crazy to believe that God's going to do something like raise somebody from the dead. We're going to fast forward a little bit and talk about Moses now. Again, I'm not picking up at the beginning of the story. This is where they have left Egypt. God could have taken them to the promised land through a direct route, an easy route, and he chose not to for a purpose. And I believe part of that purpose was to demonstrate to them what faith is about. So we're going to read in Exodus 14:10 to 14. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. So the situation is, God directs them out. Pharaoh changes his mind. He starts chasing them with an elite army. They pin them into a position where all they have is 2 mountains on each side, a sea in front of them, and a royally ticked off army behind them. What's the reasonable response? Freak out. What are you doing, Moses? Come on, why did you lead us here? That's the normal response. That's the reasonable response. You are in a dire situation. Have a meltdown. Moses responds, and he answers the people, do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. So the people act in a reasonable way. Moses acts in what we would call an unreasonable fashion. The people he's leading are not military people. The people that are chasing them are. And Moses says, they're all going to die. You're never going to see them. What's more unreasonable than that? Again, I'm going to kind of get you inside of Moses' head a little bit here. The Bible doesn't let us inside of Moses' head, but there's a historian named Josephus, who is a Jewish historian, lived in the 1st century. He collaborates a lot of what the Bible says. I'm going to quote some of this. He actually quotes what Moses says. Now, this is not doctrine. It's not scripture. We can't build doctrine off of it, but it's fun to look at. It gives us a little insight into what's going on inside Moses' head. Before I get to the quote, Josephus tells us that the army that was chasing them had 600 chariots, 50,000 horsemen, and 200,000 foot soldiers. So this is not a little battalion. This is the full force of Egypt coming after a bunch of ragtag slaves who've suffered their entire life. The natural response is freak out. Moses looks to the people, Josephus tells us that Moses looks to the people and says, "'Tis no better than madness at this time to despair of the providence of God, by whose power all those things have been performed, which he promised when you expected no such thing." He looks at them, they're freaking out, and he says, "You guys are nuts. This is not how we need to act." He then turns to God and he says, "God, you got to get us out of here, so that the mountains will open themselves if thou commandest. Lay the mountains flat and we can walk out of here, God. We'll get out. And that the sea also, if thou commands it, will become dry land. Nay, that we might escape by flight through the air, if thou should determine we should have that way of salvation." Can you think of anything more crazy than that? Hey guys, we're going to fly out of here. God's going to levitate us across the sea. This is unreasonable faith. So in this story, we see the people respond out of reason. And Moses says, you guys are actually being unreasonable. The most reasonable response to our situation is to expect God to do the most unreasonable thing. That's faith. We expect big things of our God. The last guy I'm going to talk to you about out of the scriptures is Gideon. I don't have a slide with this because the story, there wasn't any one part of it that I could really nail down, but the story's in Judges 6, 7, and 8. And many of you know the story. Gideon is called, the Israelites are going back and forth from serving God to not serving God. God rescues them, and they go back and they rescue and all that stuff. And Gideon wants to restore Israel again. The Midianites are encamped outside of Israel, and God says to Gideon, you need to go out there and I'm going to fight for you. You take care of this. And Gideon says, you got the wrong guy. He does not willingly step out in faith. He says, I'm not that guy. You got to prove this to me, God. So God proves it to him. So he says, okay, I'll go rally the troops. So he rallies about 32,000 men to his side. The army of Midianites that's outside, it says their camels were as the sands of the shore. So 32,000 versus a numberless amount of people. That's not good odds. God's going to have to show up. So Gideon's still kind of acting in faith here. He's ready to go out, and God says, you got too many people. I think they might actually get a big head if we go out with those kind of numbers. Gideon's like, okay. So he weeds them down to 10,000. And at this point, I can't picture inside of his head, but I got to think he's sitting there going, all right, God, you are going to have to show up. This is impossible, but I'm ready to go. And God tells him, Gideon, you still got too many people. What? This is an unreasonable request of our God. He's telling him, nope, we're going to whittle you down. And he ends up whittling them down to 300 men. 300 men against an army. And he says, by the way, I'm not going to give you swords. You're going to have lanterns. You're going to have trumpets, and you can yell at them. That's how they're going to make this army run away. Could you imagine going to 300 guys and say, let's go yell at the big bad army and watch them run? This is an unreasonable thing. And yet, by faith, Gideon was positioned into a place where God showed up. And that's exactly what happened.
Amen.
When they yelled, the army's swords turned upon themselves, they took flight, and they were able to chase them down and restore Israel. God uses things that seem unreasonable to us to do mighty and what we would even consider ludicrous things. So the writer of Hebrews, as he's going through this hall of faith, he basically laments that there's not enough time or paper to get into all of the mighty works that God has done through men who simply believed that God was capable of doing the impossible. And I'm kind of right there with him. I could spend all day up here talking to you guys, telling you stories. And some of you might be sitting out there thinking, that's the Bible. The Bible times are a little bit different than now. I mean, life's different. Maybe even God's a little different. He acts a little different. Well, the Bible tells us that God is the same today, yesterday, and forever. So if that's the way God acted then, he is fully capable and wants to act that way now. Yeah. The men we talked about, they are not special men. They're not. Everything that's special about those stories is God. They were obedient. That's it. Everything that you wag your head at and say, that's impossible. It's God. It's not the men. It's God. So, if God doesn't change, then there's got to be some modern examples of this. And so we'll look at some more modern examples of this. And the first guy I'm going to introduce you to is George Mueller. And he lived in the 1800s. And some of you may think, that's modern? Compared to biblical times? Yeah, that's modern. So, George Mueller, in his youth, he was not a good guy. He loved to steal. He loved to swindle people. He loved to get away with stuff. He thought the thrill of that was just something to be had. That's who he wanted to be. He wanted to get away with everything. And God gets a hold of him and converts him and ends up using George to prove that simple prayer and simple faith are the ways that God works. So George lives in England at a time when cholera epidemic had just gone through, and there's orphans running around on the street everywhere. I mean, there's just no place to put them. And God kind of pricks his heart and says, this is your call. You're going to take care of orphans. And he goes back to his wife, and they talk about it, and they pray about it, and they feel convicted that they should only ask God for everything necessary to take care of the orphans. They will never ask for a cent. God's built this into him. So at the height of their ministry, they had over 2,200 orphans housed in 5 dormitories that they were feeding, clothing, educating, all through prayer. Never once asking for a dime. At the end of his life, somebody tallied up, because he kept great records, basically how much money passed through his hands, and it was over 1.5 million pounds. Now you translate that into modern times, you're talking hundreds of millions of dollars through simple prayer. That's it. He never asked anybody. He prayed and God provided. And I'm going to share with you a couple of these stories One of them is, at a time in their ministry, it's kind of early, they've got 300 children and I think one dorm at this point. There's a family that comes in, moves in with them. They've got a little girl named Abigail. She's about 8 years old. And George is sitting in his study one morning, looks out the window, she's playing in the garden. And the cook comes in and says, well, George, it finally happened. Kids are ready to eat, we got nothing. There is not a scrap of food in this place. And George looks at him and says, I'll be in and take care of it in a minute. He looks out at Abigail and he goes outside and he gets her. And this to me is just a challenge to my core. He says to her, come watch what God will do. He has great expectations of his. He doesn't know what's going to happen. He just expects that God will move. So he goes in and he stands up, and I'm going to read you word for word his prayer because I want to show you how simplistic it is. He stands in front of 300 orphans with empty plates and says, Dear God, we thank you for what you're going to give us to eat. Amen. If I were in that situation, I'd be pleading a little harder than that. That's just my nature. Come on, God, show up. You know, this is his prayer. So he tells the kids to sit down. Plates are still empty. By the time the noise settles down from everybody scooting their chairs in, there's a knock at the door. It's the town baker. God woke me up at 2 o'clock in the morning and said, I need to bake bread for all your kids. Can you please use this bread? George is coming in. You know, yeah, we need that bread. So they're excited. They're all eating bread, warm bread. It's great. But they have nothing to drink. So by the time the noise settles down from passing out the bread, there's another knock at the door. It's the town milk guy. He's driving his wagon by and the axle breaks. And he knocks on the door and he says, I got to get all the milk off of this wagon. Can you guys please drink it? God provides. George's whole point in this was for Abigail. He's like, come watch what God will do. That's the kind of faith I aspire to. Come watch what my God will do. It's unreasonable. The reasonable response is, well, let's go down to the baker. Let's see if we can borrow some money and get some, we'll figure something out. George's response is, thanks God for what we are going to eat. Complete confidence. That's faith. There's another example from his life. He's been serving the Lord for 50 some odd years at this point. He's on a speaking tour. He's headed to Canada. And he's going by ship, and it gets kind of hemmed in by fog, and he's going to be late. He goes to the captain and he says, I've never been late for anything in my life. You need to get moving. And the captain's like, I can't see the stern of the boat. We're not moving. He says, fine, if you won't do anything, come with me. The captain's like, what? And he follows him to his cabin. George kneels down and prays a simple prayer. Again, word for word, I'm going to pray this for you, or share this with you. Dear God, I come to you now to ask you to do the impossible. You know that I need to be in Quebec by Saturday and that fog has hemmed us in. Please lift the fog so the ship can go forward and I will be on time. Amen. He turns, after he prays this, he turns to the captain. The captain starts to kind of fumble around like maybe George wants him to pray. He's like, Dear God. And George puts his hand on his shoulder and says, don't worry about it. I know you don't have the faith. And I believe it's already happened. Go open the door. So the captain goes and opens the door and his face goes ghost white. The fog is gone. Not leaving. There is not a speck of it left. In that moment in time, God answered George's prayer and did the impossible. The fog's gone. He's on time. The captain becomes a Christian. Because when great faith simple faith is on display, it affects those around us. People cannot deny it. Because God gets the glory. George doesn't get the glory for this. God gets the glory for this. One of the things that he had to do through his entire life was he prayed daily for the needs. I mean, it was a day by day. I got to get on my knees and pray today. God, you provide us food today. You provide us food today. And then he's praying also for these big things because we got to add a new dorm and we got to build a new building and all this stuff. And some people would be overwhelmed by that. Here's a little secret inside of his head. When he was asked to pray great things by God, he says that the greatness of the sum required affords me a kind of secret joy. For the greater the difficulty to be overcome, the more it will be seen to the glory of God how much can be done by prayer and faith. Yes. He basically told God, tell me to ask the biggest thing you can, and then I'll ask it bigger. Ask me to do the most ridiculous thing in the world, and I'll get excited about it, God. That's what I want to do.
That's good.
That's faith. He wanted to prove that. So the next man we're going to talk about is C.T. Studd. And this guy, if you read his life, he is a stud. I mean, he is just phenomenal. Again, it's not him, it's his following and his faith of God. Everything in his life that's great was something God did. But C.T. lived in the 1800s and 1900s, and he came from one of the most wealthy families in all of England. By the time he's 26, He's set to inherit 29,000 pounds, which is enough money to live comfortably the rest of his life and never work a day. He's set. On top of that, he is the #1 cricket player in all of England. He's gone to college on a cricket ticket, and he's ready to play pro, and he's set. His life, he doesn't have to work. He gets to have fun the rest of his life, and he's okay. God gets a hold of him through this process and challenges him, go to China. Give all your comfort up and go to China. And he says, okay. And he goes and tells some of his friends. And these are all wealthy people. They're all from Cambridge University. And they end up being nicknamed the Cambridge Seven because there are 7 of them that decide to forsake all the comforts that they have and go live in poverty in inland China to minister to people. It's an unreasonable thing. Not only do they do that, they expect God to be their provider. By the time CT's inheritance comes to him, he's ready to give it all away. God has told him, I want you to be like the rich young ruler and give it all away. So he's inheriting a fortune. He could fund his own ministry. He could do whatever he wants. And God says, get rid of it and trust me. This is an unreasonable thing again. Come on, God, there's got to be a better way. Nope, he gets rid of it. In fact, he had to fight to get rid of it. Because oftentimes when God calls us to unreasonable things, the men around us, even men within the church, men and women, they're going to be like, that's not the most reasonable thing for you to do right now. So when he's ready to give away all of this money, he's in China, he has to go to the British consulate, whoever's in charge there, to sign papers. And the guy's like, I'm not signing that, you're being stupid. Think about it. And CT's like, fine, I'll think about it for 2 weeks, but I'm going to be back here in 2 weeks and you're going to sign it. The guy says, fine, if you come back, I will. CT's there that day. Sign it. Give it away. The world's going to look at us and say, you're stupid. This is not the way you operate. But when God calls you, you obey. Yes. That's the way we operate. So there's another fun story from CT's life. He serves in China for like 20 or 30 years. He goes back to England, actually serves in India, and eventually gets called to Africa. He's in interior Africa serving. And he knows that God's called him there, and his teeth are just falling apart. They're falling out or rotting and everything. And everybody's telling him, look, CT, you need to go back on furlough. You need to rest. You need to get your teeth fixed. It's okay. He's like, no, God called me here, and I'll be here until God says otherwise. He said, it's just as easy for God to send me a dentist as me to go to a dentist. And that's the end of it. So this isn't a prayer, but this is an expectation of his God. Within that same year, a dentist shows up. It says, a year and a half ago, God told me to come here and fix your teeth, and it took me a year and a half to get here. So we see God had already provided. It was in motion when that statement came out of CT's mouth. It's just as easy for God to do it here as for me to go home and do it there. What an unreasonable, ludicrous thing to say. And yet God does that. There's within CT's life, he was challenged by people telling him he's just doing it wrong. He's going after it wrong. He's being unreasonable. And one of his sermons, the response is this right here. Are you living for the day, or are you living for life eternal? Are you going to care for the opinion of men here, or for the opinion of God? The opinion of men won't avail us much when we get before the judgment throne, but the opinion of God will. Had we not then better take his word and implicitly obey him? He's basically saying, all the naysayers, I don't care. I'm going to follow God, not men. It's the same thing Peter said. We're going to follow God, not men. So when men come at you and you have this unreasonable request that God has made of you, listen to God and not men. The last guy we're going to take a look at is Charles Muley. He's presently living in Kenya today, he and his wife and family. They are the largest family in the world. Charles, by the time he was 6 years old, his family literally threw him away. They threw him out on the streets, wanted nothing to do with him. So he's a street rat running around. God works in his life, and he ends up becoming a very prominent business owner. He's got much wealth. He's serving God. He's helping. A lot of us would say, yeah, God really got a hold of him, blessed him, gave him this life. He's set. That's great. And God kind of hits him one day in the face and says, there's a lot of kids still on the street. I want you to take care of them. I don't want you to work another day in your life. I want you to sell everything you have and take care of those kids. He gets excited about it. He goes home, tells his wife, and his wife's like, what? What? So they're talking about it for a little while, and she's being reasonable. She says, well, couldn't we just sell like some of it and use some of it to fund? He's like, no. God said sell it all and trust him. So that's what they've done. This was early in their marriage when their kids were little, so I'm guessing it's been 40 or 50 years they've been serving in this way. And they took kids in off the street, and they didn't want them just to be orphans. They wanted them to have a permanent family. So they adopted these children as muley children. And I looked on their website as I was preparing this message, and currently today there are over 3,000 children in their family and they're living in their compounds, and they've had over 23,000 children that they have rescued off the streets from simple faith.
Yes.
Again, these men are not special. God is special.
Yes. Amen.
We're all, wow, it's God that does the wow. They're obedient. When God asks them the unreasonable request, they don't brush it off and say, wow, that's a little silly, God. They say, okay, God, prove it. Prove it out in my life. So we see from the characters I introduced to you in the Bible that sometimes God had to maneuver people into that position of faith. He maneuvered them into a position where if he doesn't show up, people die. Abraham, Moses, Gideon. If God doesn't show up, they die. Somebody's dead. With the other men I've told you about, they were all asked a question. Will you trust me? That's the question. Will you trust me? And will you put yourself in a position where if I don't show up, you're a fool? Everybody says you're a fool. So that's the challenge here this morning. Is we are together in faith. We have to work at this together, encourage one another. But how do we take all of this information and really put it into practice in our lives? Well, the first thing we have to do is actually believe that God wants to use us and will use us.
Amen. That's good.
And then once we believe that, when the unreasonable requests come, we have to respond. We can't say, God, use me. I know you want to use me. Please use me. And he says, do this. And you're like, God, that's silly. That's not faith. Faith is saying, okay, God, I don't get it, but I'm walking. I'm walking with you. Then we must also begin to encourage one another. When somebody comes to you and they say, God told me to do this ridiculous thing. It's going to be great. And they're all excited about it. Don't be the wet blanket. Don't say, well, that's just not reasonable. That's not realistic. That's not, come on, people. That's not. Don't do that. We need to encourage each other in our faith. How can we stand with you in this unreasonable request? So what if we take it a step further? And instead of necessarily waiting for God to move us, we actually actively look for those positions where we can place ourselves, where if God doesn't show up, life as we know it's different. We're a fool. We're mocked. We're made fun of. We lose our job. We do something. What if we look for those positions and we say, God, look, I found one over here. If I put myself over here, you got to show up and it's going to be great because you're going to get some glory. Well, what if God asks you to start serving your community without going around and fundraising like every other missionary you know, but simply to trust him? What if after a while of doing this, God asks you, gather a few hundred volunteers with you, serve your community. You're going to feed them. You're going to give them t-shirts, but trust me for the provision. Simply ask me. Don't ask other people. Ask me. Well, welcome to Community Relief and Ignite 2020.
That's right.
I've been sharing with you my life, not head knowledge. God has been working in me and building this into me to where I have to trust him. And now I see. He's been working with me and challenging me with that question, will you trust me? And I see this opportunity where I can put myself in a position where if God doesn't show up, I'm a fool. And everybody's going to tell me along the way, that's not the way it's done. You can't simply pray and trust God. You've got to go ask these people. God has called me to this. God has been faithful till now. Why? Through the last couple of years through Community Relief, God has never let me down. So I, along with like what Josephus said, Moses said, it would be no better than madness for me to freak out and worry now. If God has proven himself faithful in my life up until this point, it would be absolutely ridiculous if I start doubting him now. I must stand in my full assurance, confidence, trust, and conviction. I'm standing in faith. That's That's what faith is. It's an expectation of my God. So some of you may still think I'm being a little unreasonable to simply trust that God will in fact provide everything we need for Ignite. That's okay. But I, like George Mueller, kind of find a secret joy in, all right, this is big God. I know it's going to have to take you. I get a little excited. God, show up. This is going to be great. So, one of the things that C.T. Studd said, that I didn't really put it up on there, but it's a quote of his that I just moves me. He said, God doesn't want nibblers of the possible, but grabbers of the impossible. Take the most ridiculous thing you can think of, but you know it's the heart of God, and grab it and say, God, I'm after that. I'm after you, God, in this way, and have faith. So I invite you to join with me together in faith as we approach Ignite, as we approach other things. We stand together in the unreasonableness of our God. We serve an awesome God. And today I'm going to leave you with your what if. What if God's calling you to some ridiculous thing? What if you felt a nudge and you've kind of, that's not it, that's not God, that's not reasonable. What's your what if? And how can I, and we as a body, stand with you in that what if, in faith, and expect our God to do great things? That's where we are. We're a family. We're going to stand together. We're going to expect the most ridiculous things in the world, because when those happen, God gets the glory. It's not about me. It's not about Pastor Mark. It's about God.
That's right. Amen.
So I'm going to invite Brian, you guys to come on up. We're going to play some music. I'm going to open this altar up to you guys. If God is moving in your heart, come now. Respond now. Don't wait. Don't say, well, maybe that's not God. What if it is? Come here. Deal with that. Ask him, God, what is this thing that you want me to do? We'll pray with you. We want to stand with you. We're the family. So Brian, if you've got a song.